The clock on the diner wall flashed 2:31 a.m., 2 July 2005, when waitress Amber Dean glanced up and froze. A tired little girl in pajama bottoms and flip-flops was padding across the linoleum floor, her hand swallowed by the grip of a heavily tattooed man. Amber recognized the child instantly, Shasta grown, missing for 47 days, her face taped to milk cartons, gas pumps, and the tip jar beside Amber's register. Authorities believed she and her 9-year-old brother had been taken by whoever bludgeoned their family to death outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Now here Shasta was, alive, sitting quietly at a corner booth while the stranger ordered pancakes. Amber's pulse hammered. Protocol said call police, stall the pair, don't let panic show. She fetched crayons and a coloring sheet for Shasta, cracked a polite smile at the man, and dialed 911 behind the counter. Minutes later, squad cars boxed the parking lot. Officers entered casually, cuffs hidden, then lunged. The man raised empty palms, resigned. Shasta bolted into Sergeant Brad Mescal's arms, whispering, "He killed my brother." The man's driver's license read Joseph Edward Duncan III. Within hours, the breakroom televisions of newsrooms coast to coast blared with the headline, "Shasta found alive, suspect in custody." Producers scrambled archival footage of the grown homicide scene, yellow tape flapping around a rural ranch house, evidence technicians lifting a blood-stained hammer, sheriff's deputies kneeling at 3 charred crosses staked in the yard. The crosses marked where 13-year-old Slade Grown had built a fort. Now they served as impromptu memorials for Slade, his mother Brenda, and her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, all beaten to death on 16 May. Dylan and Shasta had vanished that night without a trace. America feared another Elizabeth Smart ending, until the Denny's miracle. But celebration turned to horror as investigators peeled back Duncan's past. Fingerprints matched an unsolved 1997 kidnapping of 10-year-old Anthony Martinez in Beaumont, California. Another boy snatched from his front yard, found days later with tape burns on his wrists and 30 stab wounds to the torso. Washington detectives reopened a dormant file from 1996. 2 Seattle girls molested at gunpoint in a city playground. Minnesota police unearthed a 1980 conviction for raping a 14-year-old boy at knife point, a crime committed when Duncan was 17. His juvenile record, shielded for decades, now spilled across cable news crawls. Car theft, burglary, multiple escape attempts, psychologist notes warning of sadistic fantasy life focused on prepubescent boys. Reporters swarmed Tacoma, the blue-collar port city where Duncan was born on 25 February 1963. Neighbors described a lone wolf kid who rode his bike until the streetlights flickered, then slipped home to a father who drank and a mother who prayed. Teachers recalled a bright student who could program the school's first computers, yet spent detention quietly shredding notebooks into confetti. At 15, he was stealing cars. At 16, he graduated to armed sexual assault. Courts tried rehabilitation. Prison became his classroom. Parole boards offered release. He answered with new victims. After the Denny's arrest, Shasta led investigators to a remote campsite along Montana's State Regis River. There they recovered a spent shotgun shell, videotapes of sexual torture, and Dylan's shallow grave. Medical examiners estimated the boy died 1 week before his sister's rescue. It emerged that Duncan had forced the children to watch the murders of their family, chained them in a stolen rental jeep, and driven back roads for weeks, pausing only to refuel, buy fast food, or film fresh abuse. Prosecutors called it sadism on a traveling circuit. Court documents revealed why the Groans became targets. Duncan, then a fugitive from a halfway house in Fargo, had spotted the family while driving Interstate 90. Their riverside property backed onto thick timber, privacy a predator could exploit. He stalked them for days, noting routines, testing padlocks, even petting the family dog so it might not bark during the break-in. On the night of 16 May, he donned night vision goggles, cut the phone line, crept inside with duct tape and a hammer, and annihilated anyone who stood between him and the children. The public demanded to know how a man labeled danger to society in psychiatric reports managed to roam 6 states without supervision. Journalists mapped a timeline littered with missed red flags. The 2000 parole violation overlooked when a drug test form was misfiled. The 2004 traffic stop, where police failed to run his name through the national database. The halfway house manager who flagged Duncan's sudden disappearance, yet waited 48 hours to alert marshals. Each bureaucratic blank gave him room to hunt. As the federal indictment stacked kidnapping, sexual assault, and multiple murder counts, Shasta Greene became both key witness and fragile child survivor. Social workers shielded her from cameras, crafting a cocoon of therapy horses, quiet classrooms, and volunteer playdates. She testified via closed-circuit feed, voice trembling but steady. He said if I didn't be good, what happened to Dylan would happen to me. Jurors wept. Even battle-hardened marshals excused themselves from the room. In August 2008, a federal judge in Boise sentenced Joseph Duncan to death 3 separate times for Dylan's kidnapping, sexual exploitation, and murder. Idaho courts added 3 consecutive life terms for the bludgeoning deaths of Brenda, Slade, and Mark. California later secured another life sentence for Anthony Martinez. During sentencing, Duncan addressed the court in a monotone, claiming demons had ruled him since childhood and suggesting execution would free him. The judge replied, "You will never harm another innocent soul." Yes, the story did not end on a gurney. While appeals slalomed through federal courts, Duncan developed stage 4 glioblastoma. He declined chemotherapy, telling prison doctors he preferred God's timeline. On 28 March 2021, inside the medical wing of USP Terre Haute, he died at age 58, every sentence against him unfulfilled but unneeded. Still, many haunted by the Greene tragedy argue the real ending happened at that Denny's breakfast booth when an alert waitress noticed a child's uneasy eyes and chose action over fear. The moment underscores the central dilemma this series will explore: how the vigilance of strangers can intercept evil, yet how institutions meant to track monsters too often look away. Joseph Edward Duncan's violence did not erupt fully formed on that spring night in Idaho. It metastasized over decades, nourished by leniency, loopholes, and a predator's growing confidence. He was born in Tacoma, Washington on 25 February 1963. Third of 5 children in a house where discipline mixed with scripture and an undercurrent of alcohol. Teachers remembered a boy who could charm with a grin, then erupt if corrected. At age 9, he stole cigarettes. At 11, he was joyriding stolen bikes through back alleys. By 13, he carried a .22 pistol pilfered from his step-grandfather's dresser, and bragged he could make any neighborhood kid do stuff if he waved the barrel. Duncan's first arrest came at 15 for car theft, but the charge was diverted to juvenile counseling. 3 months later, he escalated. Armed with a sawed-off shotgun, he abducted at least 6 boys over separate incidents, forcing them into woodland clearings outside Tacoma, assaulting them at gunpoint, then lecturing them on secrecy. One victim broke and told parents. Detectives traced tire tracks back to Duncan. In 1980, barely 17, he stood before Pierce County Superior Court accused of first-degree rape. Psychiatrists warned he was a sadistic sexual predator who fantasized about binding victims to trees. The judge, constrained by juvenile statutes, sentenced him to indeterminate confinement at a state youth facility until his 21st birthday. Inside the reformatory, Duncan devoured college textbooks, lifted weights, and studied corrections manuals to gauge how early he might win release. Counselors wrote hopeful notes about his intellectual promise. Yet therapy transcripts revealed chilling admissions. He pictured returning to society with a vengeance. At 21, he was paroled. Within weeks, he broke into a dorm room at Washington State University, stole stereo equipment, and vanished. Parole revoked, he served another stint, only to walk free again in 1987, this time vowing to leave Washington for fresh hunting grounds. He drifted south, supporting himself through burglary sprees that crossed Oregon into California. In April 1996, 2 Seattle girls on a school picnic vanished briefly. They reappeared dazed, reporting a stranger who forced them to undress at gunpoint and molested them in nearby restrooms. Fingerprints on discarded duct tape would later match Duncan, but in 1996 the prints found no database hit. The file went dormant. A year later, on 10 April 1997, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez played outside his Beaumont, California home with friends. A man approached, claiming he'd lost his cat and needed help. When the boys refused, he produced a knife and dragged Anthony into a white car. Riverside County launched helicopters and bloodhounds, but searchers found only shoe impressions and desert dust. 15 days later, hikers discovered Anthony's body west of Indio. Wrist swollen from duct tape ligatures, 30 wounds gouged by a hunting knife. The killer left a partial palm print, but still no database match. Duncan, meanwhile, headed east. In 1997, he was stopped near Kansas City driving a stolen pickup. Officers found a handgun and child pornography. Convicted on federal weapons charges, he entered a medium security prison. There, he penned letters arguing sex offenders were scapegoats for a sick society and bragging he would one day address the Supreme Court on prisoners' rights. Psych evaluations again labeled him psychopathic, but with good behavior credits, he served only 10 years. He walked out of federal prison in 2000 under supervised release, promptly breached conditions by visiting a child-filled playground, and disappeared. An escape recorded but not immediately pursued due to clerical backlog. He surfaced in Fargo, North Dakota, reinvented as a computer student at North Dakota State University. On campus, he presented himself as a reformed felon passionate about software. Off campus, he trolled chat rooms under the alias Jet Set. A Fargo halfway house director later testified she flagged Duncan's late-night excursions and unexplained cash, but received no follow-up from parole agents. By early 2005, Duncan's fantasies sharpened into plan. He purchased night vision goggles, a Mossberg shotgun, industrial-grade zip ties, and a video camera. In April, he wrote on his personal blog that society had forced him to war and that innocence would be collateral damage. 2 weeks later, he stole a red Jeep Cherokee and pointed it west toward the Idaho Panhandle, stopping at rest areas to watch families picnic. Somewhere near Coudain, he turned off the interstate, followed the Spokane River, and found the Grona property, secluded, bordered by timber, children's bicycles leaning against a porch. He parked on a logging spur, killed the engine, and waited for the porch light to wink out. The murders of Brenda, Slade, and Mark ended any pretense of rehabilitation. Duncan shackled Dylan and Shasta, loaded them into the Jeep, and wove through 5 states. He paid cash at motels, spoke softly to clerks, and let the kids swim in roadside pools before nighttime atrocities resumed. In Lolo National Forest, he filmed Dylan tied to a tree, begging. Later, he forced the boy into a cabin bathroom, fired a shotgun through his head, and ordered Shasta to help bury her brother in a shallow creekside grave. She complied, certain the same fate waited if she cried. Days later, Duncan grew complacent. Running low on cash, craving normalcy, he steered into Coeur d'Alene and chose a Denny's, bright, open all night, a place where a father with a sleepy child might not draw suspicion. But a waitress recognized the face America had been searching for and refused to look away. Her 911 call shattered Duncan's fantasy of invisibility and saved Shasta's life. Federal marshals flew Joseph Duncan from Coeur d'Alene to Boise under the cover of night, seatbelting him inside a puddle jumper with blackout curtains drawn. The prisoner looked almost serene, wrists manacled, ankles chained, mouth murmuring what guards later said sounded like a lullaby. Behind him, an evidence truck carried the artifacts of his devastation. A Mossberg shotgun swabbed for Dylan's blood, a camcorder sealed in a static bag, night vision goggles, zip ties, and a spiral notebook whose margins crawled with arithmetic on balancing souls. Prosecutors convened at dawn in a windowless war room. On a corkboard, they mapped counts that spanned 6 jurisdictions: kidnap, aggravated sexual assault, interstate transport of minors, 3 bludgeon murders, 1 shotgun murder, 2 decades-old child homicides now roaring back to life. A single misstep could fracture the case, so they opted to try the Idaho crimes first under federal statute. The death penalty would be in play, and a conviction there could later leverage pleas in California and Washington. But building a death case meant showing not just that Duncan killed, but how deliberately, how sadistically, and how many opportunities system after system had missed to stop him. That burden soon produced evidence nightmares. Analysts queued up the camcorder tapes and cleared the screening room except for essential personnel. The first reel opened with Dylan Grona tied to a tree in dawn light, calling softly for his sister. Duncan's voice coached him to smile for the camera. Investigators lasted minutes before requesting pauses, some stepping into corridors to retch. One veteran homicide sergeant described the footage as evil, not in the poetic sense, evil that physically changes the temperature in a room. The tapes became prosecution Exhibit A, but they also created a psychological landslide. Detectives who had cultivated stoic coping mechanisms found ruptures in their sleep. One marshal resigned. A trauma therapist was assigned to every agent working close evidence, a first for the Boise office. They learned to talk in code. Roll clip 5 meant brace for the scene of Dylan's final moments. Meanwhile, cold case units dug through storage lockers across the West. In Riverside County, an evidence clerk matched Duncan's 2005 fingerprint card to the partial print on duct tape from Anthony Martinez's abduction 8 years earlier. New DNA techniques squeezed a profile from weather-bleached skin scrapings beneath the boy's fingernails. It, too, pointed to Duncan. Families of cold cases no one expected to solve fielded sudden visits from detectives carrying grim news and hesitant hope. Legal maneuvering followed like chess. Duncan surprised no one by acting as his own attorney. He fired public defenders, citing an intuitive spiritual defense. Court watchers noted how his phrasing oscillated from jailhouse law to metaphysical rants about society's war on sexual freedom. The judge, determined to insulate the record from appeals, appointed standby counsel anyway. Jury selection began under a gag order. Each prospective juror asked if they could view horrific child abuse evidence without fleeing. More than half were excused. During opening statements, the lead prosecutor spoke only 10 minutes, instead playing a silent montage. Home video clips of Dylan giggling on a trampoline, Shasta blowing dandelion seeds, a family birthday cake, then a freeze frame of the mossy campsite where investigators found Dylan's shallow grave. The silence in the courtroom amplified each image until the prosecutor finally said, "You are about to enter a darkness few will ever see. It is your civic duty to stare into it, for the sake of those who could not look away." Duncan's rebuttal was a soft-spoken tirade against government hypocrisy, ending with the claim that society's moral panic had manufactured his crimes. Jurors avoided eye contact. One alternated between notes and silent tears. Testimony began with technology experts authenticating the tapes, then ballistics, then Shasta herself. Court officials debated shielding her entirely, but she insisted, at just 9 years old, on taking the witness stand. Her voice shook yet never faltered as she recounted the hammer's first swing, the drive into the woods, the morning Dylan disappeared behind the pop-up camper, and the thunder of a shotgun. She described Duncan's promise that if she obeyed, she might earn her freedom. Defense cross-examination was minimal. Even Duncan seemed unwilling to interrogate the child he had tormented. The prosecution rested after 13 days. The defense called no witnesses. Instead, Duncan rose from counsel table and addressed the jury. He accepted responsibility, he said, but claimed society shared blame for failing to cure him. He ended by asking jurors to sentence him to death so that, in his words, all the people's pain can finish inside me. The request did not sway them. After 4 hours deliberation, the jury returned guilty on every count. The penalty phase lasted 2 more weeks, haunted by autopsy photos, victim impact statements, and forensic psychiatry. Unlike many capital cases, the jury did not wrestle long. 3 death sentences for Dylan's abduction, sexual exploitation, and murder, plus life terms stacked like sandbags for the hammer killings. Yet the Idaho verdict was only the first salvo. California prosecutors flew north to secure extradition for Anthony Martinez's murder, armed now with DNA certainty and Idaho's conviction as leverage. Duncan waived transfer, perhaps believing each move accelerated his march toward execution. In Riverside, he pleaded guilty, receiving a 4th life sentence. Washington reopens the 1996 Seattle playground assault. He pleaded guilty there as well. Each courtroom added a new layer of numbers, life without parole here, mandatory minimums there, until the ledger of punishment stretched pages. Through it all, journalists parsed the systemic failures. Why did a known violent sex offender receive unsupervised release with minimal GPS trapping? Why did a halfway house wait days to report him missing? Corrections departments blamed underfunding. Parole officers blamed case overload. Legislators called hearings. Victims advocates proposed Duncan laws to integrate fingerprint databases across states and tighten travel restrictions on sex offenders. Some measures passed, others stalled amid privacy debates. Shasta, meanwhile, stepped into a guarded adolescence. The Kootenai County Sheriff's Office quietly arranged for therapy horses and a scholarship fund seeded by strangers who had mailed $5 bills folded in sympathy cards. She returned to school under a different last name, relishing anonymity that rarely held. At 15, she testified again during an appeal hearing, composed but candid about nightmares that still jolted her awake. In 2011, the Ninth Circuit rejected Duncan's automatic appeal. He pressed on, filing handwritten petitions arguing brain abnormalities impaired moral judgment. Courts dismissed them. Then, in 2020, prison doctors diagnosed glioblastoma. Duncan declined chemo, telling staff he trusted the universe's timing. On 28 March 2021, he died in the medical wing of USP Terre Haute, conscious to the end, according to the chaplain who sat beside. His death left pending appeals moot, but also left some families feeling justice arrived by natural clock, not by gavel. Brenda Groen's sister told reporters, "I want to say I'm relieved, but nothing about this is relief. It's just the quiet after a long scream." Riverside police lowered Anthony Martinez's caseboard, solved, closed forever, yet detectives admitted closure felt theoretical. Still, tangible change seeded itself in the aftermath. States improved data sharing on parole absconders, judges received updated risk assessment training, and child rescue hotlines cited Shasta's diner miracle as proof that public vigilance saves lives. In Coeur d'Alene, a riverside park now holds a bronze statue of 3 children releasing a dove, Slade, Dylan, and Shasta, immortalized together, one lost and one survivor, symbolizing both what was taken and what endured. The courtroom sentences were inked and the tapes secured in evidence vaults, yet Joseph Duncan's shadow stretched far beyond prison walls. In the months after his Idaho conviction, newspapers called him a one-man policy earthquake. Legislators from Boise to Sacramento demanded answers. How had a twice-convicted child rapist managed to vanish from federal supervision, cross half the country, and slaughter a family? The public, raw from nightly headlines, wanted guarantees that another Duncan could never reappear. Idaho's first response was practical and immediate. State police created the Violent Offender Registry, separate from the standard sex offender list and triggered by any felony involving force. Unlike the older database, the new registry required in-person check-ins every 90 days, remote GPS audits, and automatic warrants if a single meeting was missed. County sheriffs received streamlined funding to verify addresses. Within a year, compliance jumped from 68% to almost 95%. Those numbers pleased lawmakers, but child advocacy groups warned that paperwork alone would not catch predators who deliberately slip off radar, as Duncan had done. The deeper issue, they argued, was the patchwork across state lines. Riverside County's district attorney took that argument to Capitol Hill. Citing Anthony Martinez's case, she testified that Duncan's print had sat in California evidence files while his name sat in a Washington juvenile record, an algorithmic blind spot where a 10-year-old screams vanished. Congress responded with the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006. The act mandated a national fingerprint standard, funded an integrated database, and threatened to withhold crime prevention grants from states that failed to upgrade within 3 years. Most complied, though several complained of unfunded mandates and privacy concerns. By 2009, forensic technicians could cross-reference latent prints from a 1990s murder with a fresh parole dossier in seconds, precisely the bridge that might have caught Duncan before he reached Idaho. While policy gears turned, Shasta Groene re-entered 4th grade under a sealed surname. Therapy horses and art sessions helped, but nightmares trailed her into daylight. Teachers reported she startled at locker slams, froze during fire drills, and scanned exits before sitting in any classroom. At 11, she wrote an essay titled "My Brother is My Guardian Angel," ending with the line, "When I feel safe, it's because Dylan is whispering, 'Run.'" The essay, submitted quietly for a statewide contest, won 1st place. Judges applauded its bravery. Shasta insisted it never be read aloud. Her father, Steve Groene, became a relentless presence at victims' rights rallies. Sometimes hoarse from chemo treatments, he told crowds that predators pounce on social silence. He lobbied for mandatory court-ordered trauma counseling funded by offender fines, a measure Idaho adopted in 2012. Steve lived long enough to see Shasta finish high school before losing his cancer battle in 2020. Shasta's graduation photo shows her in a sky blue gown, tassel tilted, holding a small framed snapshot of her father, proof, she said, that love stays when monsters leave. In parallel, legal scholars debated Duncan's self-representation. Some argued that allowing a sadist direct access to child witnesses amounted to re-victimization, even under standby counsel. Others countered that stripping autonomy, however grotesque, risked reversible error. The Ninth Circuit's subsequent ruling, affirming the trial judge's handling, now serves as case study in capital case seminars, the tightrope between constitutional rights and ethical decency. Media outlets also faced a reckoning. After initial saturation, the Coeur d'Alene Press instituted a grief interval, refusing to print crime scene images for 60 days unless a public safety threat persisted. Larger networks followed with voluntary guidelines limiting rebroadcast of child victim footage. Critics cried censorship. Editors replied that rating spikes should never overcome human cost. The Groene family, consulted in those policy drafts, asked only that Dylan's final moments stay sealed forever. To date, those minutes remain under court protective order. Even law enforcement training programs must request special clearance to view them.
Vigilantism simmered beneath the policy debates. Online forums overflowed with threats against registered offenders, while a fringe militia proposed community patrols modeled after colonial night watches. Idaho's Attorney General issued a rare public warning: harassment of registrants would be prosecuted, adding, "We defeat evil by law, not mob." Still, 1 year after Duncan's sentencing, an arsonist torched the vacant farmhouse where he had first spied the Greene children. Investigators found no suspects. Locals shrugged. Some called it justice, others a pointless blaze that burned only memory. On the rehabilitation front, prison psychologists reviewed Duncan's voluminous files to refine risk instruments. They noted his high IQ, persuasive charm, and ability to feign compliance, traits the older Static 99R tool weighted lightly. Those insights fed a revision that now counts early sexual sadism and manipulative behavior as heavier markers. The update, rolled out across federal facilities in 2013, flags inmates with Duncan-like profiles for intensive monitoring should they ever approach release eligibility. As for technology, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children launched a pilot program using neural networks to scan darknet forums for pre-abduction stalking chatter, keywords like night vision, paired with secluded family, or Shasta. The system pinged 23 credible threats in its first year, leading to 5 preemptive arrests. Analysts credited the program's concept to Duncan's meticulous online breadcrumb trail, which, if flagged earlier, might have raised alarms. Yet no reform erased the question haunting every town hall: why didn't the system heed warning signs already on paper? One former parole officer summarized it bluntly: "We had data, not urgency." Budget cuts had left each officer juggling up to 70 supervisees, turning check-ins into paperwork turn. Federal grants now cap that ratio at 40, and agents in high-risk units carry cell tower triangulation apps for instant absconder alerts. Whether those measures truly close the gap remains to be tested, but early audits show absconder capture times down by 42% compared to the mid-2000s. Meanwhile, Duncan's legal echo ricocheted through the appellate courts even after his death. Defense attorneys argued posthumously that a brain tumor discovered years later might have impaired decision-making, hinting at Eighth Amendment concerns. The Supreme Court declined to hear the moot claim, but academic journals seized on the debate. If a biological abnormality emerges after conviction, should it retroactively alter moral culpability? The discourse remains unresolved, a philosophical footnote to carnage. In Coeur d'Alene, the bronze statue of Slade, Dylan, and Shasta releasing a dove soon attracted sun-bleached paper cranes, each tagged with names of missing children nationwide. Every spring, volunteers clear the winter debris, polish weather-stained bronze, and replace wilted cranes with fresh ones. Shasta, now in her 20s and studying social work, attends quietly some years, standing back while families of other victims tie ribbons. She rarely speaks to journalists, but once told a college newspaper, "I don't want to be remembered for what was done to me, but for what I do next." The shockwaves from Joseph Duncan's crimes did more than tighten registries and rewrite parole manuals. They accelerated a quiet revolution in how investigators hunt predators across both asphalt and cyberspace. Less than a year after his Idaho trial, the FBI funded digital forensic strike teams trained specifically to follow what agents called the Duncan blueprint. Disposable email accounts, chat room grooming, encrypted thumb drives, and rental vehicles paid for with bundles of cash. Field offices in Seattle, Los Angeles, and Denver began sharing a live dashboard of suspicious vehicle rental contracts that matched certain triggers: night vision purchases, trunk-mounted cargo carriers, one-way mileage requests. Within 18 months, the dashboard flagged 2 separate offenders preparing interstate abductions. Both children were recovered alive. Parallel advances unfolded inside courtrooms. Duncan's self-representation, though legally permissible, had exposed a gap in safeguarding young witnesses. Idaho piloted the Shield lens, a pair of high-definition cameras that let a child testify from a private room while jurors and the defendant viewed a live feed. Unlike older closed-circuit setups, the new system gave judges instant control to mute or freeze the defendant's screen if intimidation tactics emerged. By 2012, the technology spread to 20 states, sparing dozens of minors the trauma Shasta endured on the stand. Prosecutors also began incorporating trauma-informed pacing in trials involving sexual violence. Duncan's proceeding had run 13 straight days, leaving jurors emotionally saturated and agents incapacitated. The Department of Justice now recommends built-in recovery intervals: no more than 90 minutes of graphic evidence before a recess, mandatory counseling available to court staff, and pre-trial visualization exercises to help jurors brace for disturbing imagery. Critics feared slower cases, but judges report that structured breaks actually shorten deliberations. Clarity survives when empathy isn't overwhelmed. On the investigative front, algorithms born from Duncan's typed blog posts blossomed into full-scale pattern recognition suites. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children fed millions of dark web snippets into a neural net, searching for travel phrases paired with child-related slang. Early iterations misfired on innocent camping forums, but refinements, geographic clustering, anonymized payment tracking, eventually pinpointed chatter about a Colorado family stalked at a lakeside campground. Agents intercepted the suspect with a taser, night vision goggles, and a printed map eerily annotated like the notes found in Duncan's Jeep. Both parents later testified that a single nighttime knock from park rangers likely spared their children a fate mirroring Dylan and Shasta. The case also reshaped how mental health intersects with sentencing. For decades, experts debated whether extreme sexual sadism was treatable. Duncan's courtroom soliloquies convinced many clinicians that certain pathologies cross a point of no clinical return. Post-trial, the American Association for Psychiatry and the Law updated its guidelines to flag youthful offenders who exhibit both sadistic fantasy content and coercive behavior before age 16. Such juveniles now trigger an automatic second opinion prior to any community placement. The change isn't a crystal ball, but in one Kentucky case, it redirected a 17-year-old into an intensive residential unit after staff found notebooks describing ambush plans matching the Duncan pattern. Yet progress collided with an old American fault line, the death penalty debate. Duncan's triplicate death sentences never led to lethal injection. Glioblastoma took him first. Opponents seized on that point, arguing the billions spent on capital litigation could be redirected to prevention and victim services. Proponents countered that Duncan's natural death was pure luck, not justice, and cited the emotional relief relatives felt knowing a formal execution date loomed. When the Biden administration paused federal executions in 2021, just months after Duncan's passing, op-ed pages reopened wounds. Does a system that cannot meet its own endpoint still deter monsters, or does it merely exhaust survivors in decades of appeals? Shasta avoided those headlines. Instead, she partnered with a nonprofit to develop Camp Phoenix, a summer retreat where child crime survivors ride horses, rappel, and learn coping skills anchored in neurofeedback. The first session, held in 2016 in northern Idaho's Silver Valley, hosted 12 campers aged 8 to 13. Counselors replaced standard icebreakers with gentle boundary exercises, a fist bump if you're comfortable, a wave from across the field if you're not. By sunset the final night, the campfire circle overflowed with stories of reclaimed dreams. One boy hoped to become a vet, a girl vowed to design video games starring brave siblings. Shasta kept her promise to stay backstage, but a cabin of 9-year-olds coaxed her into a group photo. She allowed one flash on condition no faces reach social media. Technological evolution marched on. The Child Rescue Coalition launched a global predictive proximity map using Wi-Fi triangulation of hash-matched abuse files. The first U.S. arrest under the program occurred in 2018 when analysts detected a device sharing child pornography from the parking lot of an elementary school in Oregon. Interrogators found a note in the suspect's glove box, campsite coordinates in Montana, only 20 miles from where Duncan had hidden with the grown children. A detective who'd worked the original Grown scene whispered, "History almost looped." Not every ripple was digital. In 2019, Idaho inaugurated the Grown Fellowship, funding law school internships focused on cold case DNA litigation. One student's fellowship brief unraveled a 1995 Wyoming child murder by persuading a judge to unseal decades-old vaginal swabs for modern testing. The matched profile belonged to a truck driver now serving time in Oklahoma. Without Duncan's catalyst, said the supervising attorney, that file would still be a dusty banker's box. Community vigilance also learned nuance. Amber Dayon, the Denny's waitress whose 911 call saved Shasta, now trains hospitality staff nationwide. Her workshops emphasize subtle behavioral cues. An adult ordering for a child who appears wary, mismatched clothing like flip-flops on a chilly night, and the phrase, "we're just passing through," delivered as a script. Since 2015, employees she trained have tipped off police to 5 separate abductions in progress. A quiet defense network built from one waitress's intuition at 2:31 a.m. Even the film industry took note. After multiple studios pitched dramatizations of the Grown case, Shasta granted limited rights on one condition: profits fund trauma therapy for child witnesses. The resulting docudrama, After the Night, premiered on a streaming platform in 2022 and opened with a disclaimer about respecting survivor agency. Critics praised its restraint, still some viewers found parts unwatchable. The director later said the intent was not to sensationalize, but to force society to keep vigil, because vigilance is the only antidote proven to work.
Meanwhile, Idaho's Violent Offender Registry faced its first stress test. A registrant with Duncan-level risk factors failed a quarterly check-in. The new system pinged local deputies, who found him packing a minivan. He claimed he was moving for a new job, but officers discovered route maps to Nevada campgrounds and a GoPro preloaded with duct tape and extra batteries. Charges of failure to register followed, likely preventing another tragic headline. Advocates hailed the incident as validation. Skeptics cautioned that one stopped predator does not equal systemic safety. Yet numbers tell part of the story. Child abduction homicides in Idaho dropped from an average of 2 per year in the early 2000s to 0 between 2014 and 2024. Nationally, the missing child clearance rate nudged from 84 to 92% within the same span. A gain NC Meek attributes partly to integrated data systems and early warning analytics inspired by the Duncan fallout. The gains are fragile, subject to funding cycles and privacy battles, but they mark progress carved from horror. In the years since Joseph Duncan's death, his name has faded from headlines, yet his legacy keeps colliding with everyday life in ways most people never notice. A mother in Boise gets a silent text alert when her child's school bus deviates more than 2 blocks off its route. Code lifted from the same geofencing protocol developed during the Duncan task force. A hotel clerk in Spokane runs a quick training app on her phone before clock-in, learning to spot the uneasy glances of children accompanied by men who pay cash. A federal magistrate in Sacramento signs an encrypted device warrant in minutes because the precedent that once took weeks now sits streamlined in the law books. Each small safeguard is a stitch in the net society wove after one failure too many. Yet with every added thread comes friction. Civil liberties attorneys warn that the rapid expansion of predictive policing tips dangerously towards pre-crime, accusing algorithms of flagging innocent travelers who happen to rent SUVs and buy camping gear. In 2024, a father of 2 filed suit after agents searched his van on I-90, mistaking his digital footprint, night vision purchase, kids' camping blog posts for the opening notes of a Duncan copycat. The lawsuit forced agencies to publish auditing standards, human review within 24 hours, mandatory deletion of data if no probable cause emerges, and documented oversight by an independent board. Privacy advocates call the reforms hollow. Law enforcement unions counter that without the early warning filters, children will die. Inside universities, neuroscience labs probe the dark frontier Duncan embodied, extreme sexual sadism tethered to high cognition. Using functional MRI, researchers have mapped atypical neural loops in offenders with similar profiles. Hyperactivity in the nucleus accumbens when shown images of fear, blunted response in the medial prefrontal cortex where empathy typically resides. The findings stoke debates that twist through ethics panels. If a brain scan one day predicts violent proclivity with 95% accuracy, does society intervene before a crime? And how? Conferences end in uneasy stalemate, the air thick with the memory of a hammer in Idaho. Meanwhile, survivors are reshaping justice from the inside. Shasta Greene, now 28, finished her social work degree and accepted a position on the Idaho Governor's Victim Services Council. She helped draft the Survivor Voice Initiative, which requires state task forces to reserve at least 2 seats for people who have lived through violent crime. The first cohort included a trafficking survivor from Twin Falls and a former foster youth from Pocatello who endured serial abuse. Voices once relegated to panels after the policies were written, now guiding them from inception. When critics argued that trauma clouds objectivity, Shasta replied in testimony, "Objectivity without humanity is the door Joseph Duncan walked through." At Camp Phoenix, the retreat she co-founded, sign-in sheets have grown from a dozen names to more than 80 each summer. Counselors teach kids how adrenaline hijacks memory, why nightmares repeat, and how to hack the body's panic loop with deep breathing drills. During the closing ceremony, all campers write fears on flash paper. The strip vanishes in a burst of orange and a gasp of delight. The ritual mirrors a choice Shasta made as a child, when she decided Dylan would become her guardian rather than her ghost. A therapist watching the sparks calls the exercise controlled liberation. Law enforcement, too, is learning restraint. The violent offender registry that once pinged deputies for every missed check-in now tiers alerts based on contextual data, travel permits, employment logs, therapy attendance, reducing false positives and allowing officers to focus on high-threat cases. The change arrived after rural sheriffs complained of alarm fatigue, a problem eerily similar to the system overload that let Duncan slip away in 2005. The refined model cut field visits by 30%, yet increased absconder capture by 10%. In a press briefing, Idaho's public safety director called the evolution precision vigilance, a phrase critics mocked, but statistics support. Media portrayals have mellowed. The streaming docudrama After the Night triggered surprisingly thoughtful conversations online. Its most shared clip, a quiet scene of Shasta visiting the Riverside Memorial, laying 3 stones on a driftwood log. Viewers posted thousands of comments, not about Duncan, but about resilience. What gets a kid from that night to college? How do we teach our sons to stand up against men like him? The platform's content moderation team, braced for sensational hashtags, instead amplified resource links to crisis hotlines and a printable Spot the Signs guide. Engagement metrics showed a rare alignment of virality and public service. Still, friction remains between protection and liberty. The U.S. Senate is debating the Child Digital Safety Act, which would require social media companies to scan private messages for grooming language predicted by the same neural nets that trace child porn hashes. Tech companies warn of encryption backdoors. Parents groups brandish photos of missing children. The spokesperson for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children tells a congressional panel, "When we ask how far surveillance should go, we must picture 2 faces, the innocent child who needs rescue and the innocent citizen who deserves privacy." Behind him, a slide shows Shasta at age 8, pixelated for respect, beside a silhouette labeled Future Unknown Child, the one policymakers hope to save before harm. On the ground, communities are finding their own middle paths. Neighborhood watch captains in Coeur d'Alene swapped nightly patrols for quarterly workshops on trauma-informed support, turning the conversation from Stop the Next Duncan to Help the Next Shasta. Libraries host digital safety classes led by teenagers who explain encryption and burner phones in language older adults finally understand. A high school band even renamed its annual charity concert Notes for Dylan, proceeds funding therapy dogs at elementary schools. Perhaps the most telling shift surfaces in language. Reporters now reference the Greene murders as the Duncan case less often, opting for terms like the Idaho family tragedy or the Greene recovery story.
Survivors, advocates, and even detectives whisper that evil should not own the headline. Endurance should. In a recent interview, Shasta said, "Monsters want their names remembered. My goal is that one day you'll have to Google his." She smiled, knowing people will. And so the balance point between vigilance and fear, justice and liberty, remains a living negotiation, shaped by courts, clinics, classrooms, and late-night diners, where a waitress might again notice a child's silent plea. The systems born of Duncan's devastation are better, not perfect, stronger, not infallible. They are scaffolds for an alert public, blueprints inked in the blood of the past to shelter the future. If this series has kept you reading, let it keep you watching. Pay attention to the small oddities, the mismatched shoes, the forced smile, the child in the wrong hands. One phone call can rewrite a fate. Share what you've learned, trust your instincts, and remember that vigilance need not be fear when guided by compassion. Thank you for staying through every chapter of this harrowing journey. If these stories of resilience and reform moved you, please tap the like button. It helps more people find the information that could save lives. Subscribe for weekly deep dives where true crime meets true change, and ring the bell so you never miss a moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts below. How can society guard innocence without sacrificing freedom? Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can turn nightmare lessons into daylight safeguards.